6, the Honourable David Cunliffe.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. To the Minister of Finance, does he agree with the analysis by Brian Gaynor in the New Zealand Herald in 1999 that foreign buyers during the asset sales of the late 1980s and 90s enjoyed a return of more than $13 billion in the first 12 years following the sales, and would he be happy for similar large profits to once again be lost overseas under the current government's asset sales policy?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, no, and that's why the government's doing it differently than Labor did it in the late 80s.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, to the Minister, what measures in his privatisation policy would ensure that the shares sold by the government would not end up in foreign hands, as they did with Contact and the BNZ, given that Treasury has found, quote, significant participation by foreign investors would be essential, close quote.
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, as we've said many times in this Parliament, the government disagrees with the advice. New Zealanders will be at the front of the queue. The New Zealand government will retain 51%, and even in the case of Contact Energy, which was sold down over 10 years ago, a significant proportion of those who initially bought the shares are still on the register 14 years later. New Zealand shareholders are loyal to New Zealand companies.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, is he concerned that his privatisation policy would see energy company boards answerable to foreign shareholders who care about maximising their profits, not the overall economic health of New Zealand?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, no, because the majority shareholder will be the New Zealand government. Among the other shareholders will be the New Zealand Super Fund, the ACC, 1.7 million Kiwi savers and Kiwi mums and dads. And I think the opposition are trying to cover up for the faults in the program that they put together back in the 1980s. We're trying to learn from their lessons, which when they put the Air New Zealand model together 5 or 6 years ago, Air New Zealand has worked under mixed ownership, and these companies would work under mixed ownership as well.
Supplementary, Mr Speaker.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Further to the Minister's answers, what advice has he received about the rights of minority shareholders, especially substantial minority shareholders, including the right to compensation for lost opportunities or the right to require a majority shareholder to increase their equity or else face a dilution of their shahareholding?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, I haven't received any detailed information on that, but the advice I do have is that if the government is a 51% shareholder, then it has more rights than all the other shareholders put together. And of course, the government would exercise those rights.
The Honourable Sir Roger Douglas.
Mr Speaker, does he agree that Telecom was sold in 1990 for $4.25 billion, which in real terms is $2 billion more than its recent market capital value? And does this show that government ownership of assets is not the economic utopia the Labour Party makes out when risks involved are taken into account?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, that is a good point. People who buy into any commercial company have to face commercial risk. In fact, the value of Telecom was in 1999 $16 billion and today is less than $5 billion. And whether the government owned those shares or private investors owned those shares doesn't change the risks of operating in the communications market.
The Honourable David Cunliffe.
Mr Speaker, in light of his previous answer, which essentially condones asset stripping by the buyers of SOEs, is he aware that an SOE is legally required to exhibit a sense of social responsibility by having the interests of its community in which it operates and to be a good employer? But if energy companies were removed from the SOE Act under privatisation, their boards would be legally required to act only in the best interests of the company, regardless of the consequences for the country as a whole.
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, if we're talking about asset stripping and price gouging in energy companies, it would have been under the Labour government. where energy prices went up 70% in 9 years, and Labor sold down billions of dollars worth of assets from those SOEs and took the cash.
The Honourable Sir Roger Douglas.
Mr Speaker, in light of his answer about the...
The Honourable Sir Roger Douglas.
Mr Speaker, in light of his answer about the sale of Telecom, does the Minister believe that the then Deputy Prime Minister took these risks into account when Telecom was sold in 1990 by a government? And are these risks part of the reason behind the government policy to partially sell some assets?
The Honourable Bill English.
Well, Mr Speaker, it is a fact of history that I think the Deputy Prime Minister at the time was the Right Honourable Helen Clark, who oversaw the sale, and at her right hand was the Honourable Phil Goff. And a lot of people aren't going to vote for the Labor Party until they apologise for the actions they took then.
Order. Order. I am unhappy about that because the question came from the ACT Party and was used to attack the Labour Party. And that is not, in my view, a very fair situation. To make up for it, I've added one to the Labour Party's supplementary questions today. Point of order, the Honourable Bill English. Point of order.
Mr Speaker, the primary question was an unusual one, I might say, but we should look at it. It refers to analysis by Brian Gaynor in the New Zealand Herald in 1999.
Order. I don't need to have a debate on this matter. Order. Minister resume his seat. I took the nature of the primary question into account during a number of the answers given. The Minister made considerable criticism was made of the Labour Party in his answers, and I accepted that as being perfectly reasonable given the primary question. That was taken into account. But for the ACT Party to ask a question that didn't really require the Labour Party to be attacked, I don't think is reasonable. And the Minister had answered it perfectly properly at the start. Didn't need to go on to that last attack. It caused disorder in the House, and to discourage that kind of thing, I've awarded the Labour Party a further supplementary question. Point of order, the Minister, the Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, I noticed that first point is, I think, if you give me a point of order, then generally the practice has been that the member is allowed to finish their point of order, even if the Speaker wants to rule on it in a way they don't agree with.
Let me be very clear on this. That's not the way I operate at all. If I don't, as Speaker here, within a few seconds what the issue of order is, order. I accept absolutely that was not the Honourable Shadow Leader of the House. But if I don't hear within a few seconds what the issue of order is, I sit members down. I've even asked the Prime Minister to sit down. And I'm absolutely even-handed on that. I will not have issues debated by way of point of order. I've made it very clear in relation to this question. I considered the primary question had some provocation in it, sought opinion, and had some provocation. I gave the Minister a lot of licence in how he answered that question. My concern was when a third party, and there's nothing wrong with the third party question, and the Minister answered it perfectly well for a start, but then deviated into attacking the Labour Party, which was where I became unhappy, because attacking the Labour Party was not essential to the answering of the question by the Honourable Sir Roger Douglas. And the easiest way to me seems to be to give the Labour Party a further question to discourage that kind of answer. Point of order, the Honourable Rodney Hyde.
Mr Speaker, I ask you to reflect on this. I'm not challenging your ruling, but I'm thinking about it going forward, Mr Speaker, that this is a debating chamber. And members are here to debate, and it's natural that they debate policies and parties. And that's what Bill English was doing.
Resume his seat as well. That's not to do with... This is actually question time for the Honourable Rodney Hyde. This is not a debate. The rules for question time are very clear, and it is not a time when we have debates. We have questions asked, hopefully, and answers given. And that's enough. I've simply decided to give the Labour Party a further question. But I will say to some of the front bench on my left, not the Shadow Leader of the House, but some of his colleagues, that when points of order are being heard, they will not interject. Now, does the Honourable David Cunliffe wish to use it? The Honourable David Cunliffe, supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. Given that the budget documents and the investment statement attached to it show only a $200 million write-down in dividends, but project a $6.8 billion sale price, that implies a 3% return on assets. Can the Minister explain why private shareholders would want to buy electricity companies for a 3% return on assets and not push up power prices higher than they currently have been?
The Honourable Bill English.
Mr Speaker, almost anything will be an improvement on how these assets were run up to 2008, where electricity prices were pushed up 70% in 9 years, but the companies paid minimal dividends equivalent to 2 to 3% returns. So if you want a track record of very high power prices and low returns, it was these assets under the Labour government.
Point of order, the Honourable Trevor.
Mr Speaker, that was while it was long, it was actually a relatively simple and clear question, which went to why would people buy something for 3%, for a 3% return, if they weren't going to put the prices up. So it was a forward-looking question and not one which looked backward. There was no attempt to address it.
Well, order. In fairness, I don't think it's possible to tie ministers to answer exactly the way members may wish to have them answer. I mean, the question did talk about dividends, did ask about dividends and prices, and in answering, the minister went back over a bit of recent history around dividends and prices in answering the question. I listened very carefully to see if he overstepped the mark, in my view, in terms of attacking the questioner. I don't believe he did. I think the answer was not unreasonable to the question. It may not have been what the questioner wanted, but it was still not an unreasonable answer in my view. The Honourable Trevor Mallard.
I do want to litigate. So the question was about dividends and prices going forward. The reply was all about dividends and prices going back. It couldn't address...
Order. Often a way to understand how prices and dividends may behave in the future is to look at the way they've behaved in the past. And it's not unreasonable in answering an economic question like that to look at what the history has been in the recent past to better understand how things might be in the future. The member won't interject, I'm on my feet. Question number 7, Nikki Kay.
Mr Speaker, question to the